Okay, so the next question we have is there a greater interest in contemporary art amongst collectors?
Obviously there is a bigger interest in collecting. Again, we have a tremendous, just the fact, most of the small galleries on Queen West are actually commercial galleries.
Right.
The Paul Petro, Jamie Angel, Catherine Mulhare, and all that, you look in, you just have to open up Now magazine and count the number of galleries that we have in the city. Sometimes there's over 200 exhibitions in a week going on in Toronto. And organizations like Gallery TPW, we started an annual fundraiser 22 years ago, and we were a group of photographers who had, there were no photography galleries, there was no Stephen Bulger, there was no market. We had people like Ed Bertinsky hanging their work in our annual sale and then taking it home after the sale was over.
You didn't buy heads back then?
I had one Ed I bought back then. But, now we have people lined up to get Ed Bertinsky. And good example of, this is specific to photography, but we had presented Ed Bertinsky's first solo show in Toronto. I can't remember, it was 87 or 88, but it was actually a touring show that was assembled by the Canadian Museum of Contemporary Photography. And at the time, I had a discussion with the curator at the National Gallery. They phoned me, and they wondered if they wanted to get my opinion. They were obviously canvassing a lot of people, but they weren't really sure whether they should buy a color photograph, like an exhibition full of color photographs. Because at the time, the museums were so stuck in certain ideas. It's true that earlier color material was a bit less stable, but they were stuck in ideas of archival standards, and black and white photography passed their archival standards, but color photography didn't. And there were no curators of photography in Canada at the time, other than Jim Borkham at the National Gallery. And there were no commercial galleries. So, talking specifically about one medium, there was a case where, we would have 50 photographers come to a meeting, and it would be Ed Bertinsky and George Whiteside and, Isaac Applebaum and Vid Engelbix and Bob Burley and Blake Fitzpatrick and Barb Rassman. There's all these people, and, there were a few, Barb Assman and Susie Lake had showed us Jared, or I think it was Jared Sable at the time. But there were no people collecting photography. There was no market. There were no dealers. There was no institutional support. So just looking at photography as a medium, today there's a full-page article in the Star about the idea that, if the stock market's so bad and you're going to lose your money there, maybe you should invest in photography. There's a full-page article about promoting the idea of investing in art and specifically photography rather than the stock market. So for sure, there's an interest, and we have cultivated it ourselves. The public galleries, the private galleries, over the last 20 or 30 years.
Steve, you want to jump in?
Well, I think that there's a much wider, broader way that a collector can be involved. Art has kind of exploded into so many fragments. So there's so many ways to bite into it, so many angles, and photography is just one example of it. But, there was an example of, let's peel it back even before photography got on the scene in the 80s and late 80s, before it became incorporated, grafted into the fine art, and it was really quite a separate discipline until then. But art in the 70s, with performance, conceptual, all of it, art really wasn't anything you could take home with you. And those early practitioners, like Vito Acconci is a good example. The art, about 10 years ago when I started the magazine, I had a short little interview with them at one of his shows at Barbara Gladstone. And he was saying when he started doing his installations, and referring to a show in Los Angeles at the time, they would just put the show up whatever was involved, plywood, whatever. At the end of it, it was knocked down, and it was just a set, really. And now, over time, much of that really has become something you can actually take home with you, so it's more permanent. So, whereas things ended up being much more conceptual, and even the conceptual art now has become, I guess, integrate itself into all kinds of areas. So where Vito Conci now, much of his work is even architectural. It's sculptural, architectural. It's more physical. So in that way, the word has really become flesh in that sense in many ways. And art has diffused itself into so many different aspects. Even some of the more far-out performance pieces, in a way, there's a way of, spectacle is one end, but it finds itself into every crevice. So it reaches more areas of everybody's life.
Well, of course, all these movements are, tend to be reactions to what came before it. And conceptual art of the 70s was kind of a reaction to pop art, and the idea there was to, the dematerialization of the object to resist art as a commodity. A commodity, and certainly in the last, 10 years or more now, and of course amongst younger generations of artists that are very consciously attempting to make their art as commodifiable as possible, even if it might be a fragment of an installation or something like that, So it's a different world we live in, and then looking at the way the art fairs have evolved over the last, 6 to 8 years, in places like Miami, for instance, where they went from 1 fair to 6 fairs to 12 to 23 last year. It'll all be interesting to see what happens this year, considering we're in the midst of an economic meltdown, and
it's up to 27, by the way, this year.
There's 27 this year.
But all those were booked before the bubble burst.
Which sort of leads into the next question is, how does contemporary Canadian art figure in the international community? So maybe you can talk about how maybe some Canadian artists are seen at some of the fairs, for instance, or,
Well, to answer that precisely, Canadian art does not figure into international art in any way, shape, or form. And the Canadian artists that are out on the international scene, there are more Canadian artists showing internationally now than ever before, and they're getting themselves, and sometimes help with the galleries or public institutions. Moke has done a number of international shows. But to be a Canadian artist internationally, it does not mean anything at all. In some ways, maybe that's a good thing, because we have not yet become exoticized enough, like Chinese art has, for example. The art world, of course, is very, is all about trends, just like any other field of endeavor. What's trendy, what's hot, all of a sudden Chinese art's blowing up, which is very exciting. That's never quite happened to Canadian art. And up until recently, like I'm saying, there's this younger generation of artists and galleries that are out there doing it for themselves. And considering Canada is a G8 country, our public support for contemporary art is pathetic and embarrassing compared to G8 countries especially, and most other countries around the world. Just came back, as a matter of fact, from a Canadian Museum Directors Conference out in Calgary, and there is talk now that the National Gallery of Canada and Heritage Canada have abandoned the Venice Pavilion, that as it stands today, there is Canada's participation as an official country in Venice is in serious jeopardy the year after this coming one. This is 2009, 2011. So that's You know, I mean, if it's happening at all, it's really, honestly, a lot of it's up to the individual artists that are doing it themselves. Total DIY kind of phenomenon.